My name is Vera Calloway, though in the Navy they called me Phantom. I'm 32 years old, a former cryptologic warfare officer. And for the last 18 months, I've been rebuilding a life that someone I loved tried to quietly dismantle. I spent 8 years learning how to listen to what wasn't being said, intercepting signals, reading silence, decoding things people assumed were invisible. None of that training prepared me for sitting across a conference table from my own sister while she explained, with perfect legal poise, why I shouldn't be trusted with our mother's estate. Her name is Audrey. She's 4 years older than me, a corporate attorney in Chicago, and the kind of person who has always believed that competence is measured in billable hours and zip codes. She never said she was ashamed of my service. She said things like practical and realistic, and Vera, you've been away for so long, you don't understand how things work here anymore. Different words, same meaning. When our mother was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's the previous spring, Audrey flew in from Chicago and immediately started making arrangements. I was still finishing a 14-month deployment out of Norfolk when I got the call. I flew home on emergency leave with a duffel bag and a security clearance I couldn't talk about, and Audrey met me at the door of our childhood home in Akron, Ohio, with a folder of documents and a look that said she had already decided how this was going to go. Our mother had done well for herself. A retired pediatric nurse, she had paid off the house in full, accumulated modest but real savings, and maintained 2 small rental properties she managed herself, nothing extravagant. Midwest practical. But enough that Audrey had engaged a financial advisor, an estate attorney, and a property management company before I had even unpacked my bag. You don't need to worry about any of this, she told me. I've handled it. I asked to see the documents. She slid one folder across the table. I asked about the second. She said it was preliminary. I asked a third time, and she looked at me the way she always had, slightly above me, slightly tired of the effort it took to explain things to someone who had spent her adult life over there, doing whatever it was I did in places she couldn't find on a map. I'm trained to notice the pause before an answer. I wrote down the date and exactly what she said. That was a habit I developed in the service. Small black notebook, the kind you can buy at any CVS for $2. Every significant conversation, time-stamped. My commanding officer once told me that the most dangerous thing in any operation isn't the enemy. It's your own memory, which rewrites itself to protect your emotions. So you write it down before the rewriting starts. I had been keeping those notebooks since I was 23. What I found over the following weeks, quietly and without confrontation, was that Audrey had moved faster than I realized. She had positioned herself as the primary contact for our mother's financial accounts, redirected mail, and had begun conversations with the estate attorney about a power of attorney structure that would have given her unilateral control over major decisions. None of it was illegal, exactly, but none of it had been discussed with me. When I raised it calmly, she said I was being paranoid. When I raised it a second time, she said my deployment had affected my judgment. The third time, she said, and I wrote this down word for word, Vera, you've been flagged for psychological support twice since you enlisted. That's not nothing. I'm not sure you're in the best place to be making financial decisions for someone as vulnerable as Mum. I set my pen down. I looked at her. How do you know about that? She didn't answer. She changed the subject. The psychological support referrals she mentioned were both voluntary. Once after a particularly difficult 6-month rotation where I lost a colleague. Once after I returned from a classified assignment that I am still not permitted to describe in detail. I went willingly, I completed the sessions, and both times I was cleared for full duty. They were not flags, they were not disciplinary. They were what healthy people do when they have been through something hard. But Audrey had gotten hold of that information somehow. I didn't know how yet, and I understood immediately what she intended to do with it. I did not argue. I thanked her for dinner, kissed my mother good night, and drove back to the extended stay hotel on Route 18, where I was sleeping while I figured out next steps. In the parking lot, under a fluorescent light that buzzed like a dying insect, I opened my notebook and wrote everything down. Then I called a friend from my unit who had gone on to become a JAG officer. She gave me 3 names, attorneys in Ohio who handled elder law and estate disputes. I called all 3 the next morning. I want to be clear about something. I did not do any of what followed out of anger. I want that on the record because it matters to me. I was not trying to win. I was trying to make sure my mother's wishes were honored and that the record was accurate. There is a difference between revenge and correction, and I've spent too many years in environments where that distinction meant everything. My attorney, a woman named Charlotte who had the kind of calm you only develop after years of watching people lie under oath, listened to everything I had and then said, "We're going to need to establish exactly how that personal information left a secure channel." It took 6 weeks to trace. The referral records had been accessed through my mother's insurance portal, where Audrey had been listed as a secondary account holder. She had used that access to download documents that had no legitimate bearing on estate planning. Charlotte filed a formal complaint. She also filed an injunction pausing the power of attorney process. Audrey called me furious. I let it go to voicemail. I saved the voicemail. Here is the part I have not told many people. 3 weeks after the injunction, I was on a commercial flight back to Akron from DC, where I had met with Charlotte in person. I had my notebook, a window seat, and was planning to sleep for the first time in 4 days. My row partner was a woman about my age, a medical resident from Cleveland Clinic based on her badge, and she fell asleep before we left the gate. Audrey had taken the same flight. I didn't know until I was already seated. She was 6 rows back. I know this because I heard her voice while boarding, that specific register she uses when she's performing composure, and I did not turn around. We were over Western Pennsylvania when the pilot's voice came through the intercom, not the routine altitude update, a different tone. Measured but tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a technical issue with our primary navigation system. We've notified air traffic control and we are not in any danger, but we will be delaying our descent into Akron Canton while we work through procedures. Please remain seated with seatbelts fastened." The cabin shifted. Not dramatically, the particular kind of quiet that fills a space when 200 people simultaneously decide not to say what they're thinking. I looked out the window. Overcast. The kind of dense flat cloud cover that sits over Ohio in November like a ceiling that forgot to stop coming down. I tracked the engine rhythm, even. I tracked the pitch. Stable. Whatever was happening, we weren't in a mechanical emergency. Navigation. The flight attendant appeared at my elbow. She was young, maybe 24, and she was doing an excellent job of looking professional while moving very fast. She leaned down and said quietly, "Are you Vera Calloway?" I said yes. She said, "The captain is requesting your assistance. Can you come forward?" I had not told anyone on that plane anything about myself. I was in civilian clothes. Jeans, a grey pullover, my old unit's coin in my front pocket out of habit. I had not spoken to the crew. I said, "How does the captain know my name?" She said, "He said to tell you Phantom." I went very still for a moment. Then I unbuckled my seatbelt. I heard Audrey's voice from 6 rows back, sharp and confused. "Vera, what's happening? Where are you going? You need to sit down." I didn't look back. The cockpit was close and urgent. The captain was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, silver at the temples, the kind of face that had seen long haul and knew how to manage it. His first officer was working the secondary radio with focused intensity. On the navigation display, something was cycling, updating, resetting, failing to commit. The captain looked up. He said my rank before my name, which told me he had looked me up properly. "Lieutenant Commander Calloway. I was told you did CSAR coordination work out of Sigonella, that you hold certifications in JTAC relay protocols and encrypted nav communication." I said, "That's correct. What's your situation?" He said, "Our primary BR navigation is down. We've had a software cascade failure. GPS is feeding bad data. We're getting conflicting altitude readings between instruments, and Akron approach can't lock our ILS signal. We have a 2-hour fuel window. Secondary comms are functioning, but I need someone who can work. I have quick radio channel and talk directly to Akron Center outside the standard civilian frequency. My first officer has never touched military protocol. Have-quick is a frequency hopping communication system. Military. Jam resistant. I had used it for 3 years coordinating search and rescue operations across the Mediterranean. It is not complicated once you know it. It is completely opaque if you don't. I took the jump seat. There is a version of this story I could tell where I was calm and heroic and moved with cinematic precision. The real version is that my hands were steady because I made them steady. Because I have a specific memory I return to when my nervous system wants to overtake my judgment. The first time I sat a CISA coordination post during a live recovery, 24 years old, 3 operators on the ground in weather that was trying to kill them. My voice being the only thing threading the location to the helicopter crew above the cloud layer. My supervisor had told me beforehand, your voice is the instrument. Tune it. I tuned it. I identified the half QA frequency, authenticated with the protocol string I had memorized long before I ever expected to need it outside of a deployment, and established contact with Akron Center's military coordination desk, a channel that exists exactly for situations like this. Staffed by people who know how to cut through civilian frequency congestion and deliver clean navigational data. I said my call sign once. There was a pause of about 4 seconds. Then the response came back crisp and immediate. What followed was approximately 9 minutes of technical communication that I will not walk through in full because it would require more context than is useful here. The short version, I relayed our aircraft's actual position as calculated through the HAVQuick data stream, corrected the altitude discrepancy by cross-referencing 2 independent ground transponders that civilian ATC couldn't access in that weather configuration, and coordinated a clean ILS handoff to Akron approach that gave the captain a locked, reliable glide path. The captain flew the approach. He was good. He didn't need me on the controls, he needed me on the radio, and I was there. We landed 14 minutes later. Clean. The passengers didn't applaud. Most of them didn't know anything had happened beyond a minor delay. I stayed in the cockpit through rollout and taxi while the captain completed his checklist. He didn't say much. When we stopped at the gate, he turned and said, I've been flying 26 years. That channel saved us 2 hours of circling in deteriorating weather with an instrument failure. Thank you. I told him I was glad I could help. I meant it without drama. When I came out of the jetway, Audrey was waiting. She had been in the back. She had heard the flight attendant come for me. She had watched me walk forward and not return until we were on the ground. Her face had a look I had never seen on her in 32 years of being her sister. Not anger. Not condescension. She looked like she was meeting me for the first time. She said, What did you do up there? I said, My job. I walked past her to get my bag. The legal process took 4 more months. I will not pretend it was clean or painless. Audrey contested the injunction. Our mother, to her immense credit, sat with both of us in Charlotte's office in January and said, clearly and without confusion, that she wanted equal representation in any decisions about her estate, and that she had never intended to exclude me. She said it into a recorder. She said it with her hands folded in her lap and her voice even, the same voice she had used for 40 years with frightened children in the ER. The power of attorney was restructured. Joint authority, equal standing. Neither of us able to act unilaterally on major decisions. Charlotte negotiated a provision that required documented communication between both parties for any transaction over $5,000. It was not what Audrey had planned. It was what our mother wanted. The records Audrey had accessed improperly were flagged in the formal complaint and became part of the estate record. She was not charged criminally. The access, while improper, existed in a legal gray area that Charlotte said wasn't worth the cost of pursuing, but it was documented. Formally, the way I document everything. In February, Audrey and I had a conversation I had not expected. She came to the house on a Sunday afternoon, and I was in the kitchen making soup because it was 19 degrees outside and I have always cooked when I need to think. She sat at the table and she was quiet for a long time, which was unusual for her. Then she said, I did not access those records to hurt you. I accessed them because I was scared. I turned from the stove. I said, Scared of what? She said, that you were going to come back and dismantle everything I'd put together. That you'd decide I'd done it wrong and tear it all down. I spent 2 years managing Mom's situation alone while you were, wherever you were. I didn't know how to hand that off. I thought about what to say for a long time. I said, You could have just told me that. She looked at her hands. She said, I know. I will be honest. That didn't fix it. Not all the way, not immediately. Trust is not a switch. But it was the first true thing she had said to me in months, and I understood the shape of it even if the wound was still there. I told her, I'm not here to tear down what you built. I'm here because she's my mother, too. That was always true. The thing no one tells you about coming home from service is that you are returning to a world that kept moving without you, and the people in it have sometimes reorganized around your absence in ways that feel permanent. Audrey had filled the space I left. I understood that. Understanding it did not mean accepting the way she had used that space, but it meant I could stop making her the villain of a story that was more complicated than that. The estate matters were resolved by spring, the rental properties were maintained with proper management agreements. Our mother's healthcare directive was documented properly. The accounts were accessible to both of us with full transparency. I did not go back to active duty. My service contract had ended, and I had been offered a position with a private maritime security firm that contracts with the Coast Guard on communications infrastructure, work that uses everything I know without requiring me to be anywhere classified. I took it. I work remotely from Akron 3 days a week and travel the other 2, which means I'm close enough to be at our mother's door in 20 minutes if she needs me. 6 months after the landing, I got a letter from the captain. He had tracked me down through the airline's security liaison with the military records request. He had enclosed a copy of the incident report, which noted my assistance and my credentials, and had written at the bottom in actual handwriting, "I hope you are well wherever you've landed. You have a gift for being exactly where you need to be." I read it twice. Then I put it in my notebook. There is a woman in our mother's Tuesday morning exercise class, a retired air traffic controller from Cleveland Center, 71 years old, sharp as a level. Her name is Barbara. She started asking me questions a few months ago about HAV QWIC protocols and whether civilian controllers ever received training in them. I answered carefully because some of it I still can't discuss in detail. But she listened the way controllers listen, tracking multiple threads, filing information precisely. Last month, she told me she wanted to write a proposal to her old facility about a cross-training protocol for military frequency emergencies. She asked if I would review it. I said yes. I don't know if the proposal will go anywhere. These things rarely move fast in federal infrastructure. But I spent a Sunday afternoon at her kitchen table going through draft language, and I thought about how much of what I know exists only because someone took the time to pass it forward. A supervisor who said your voice is the instrument, a SEAL who said write it down before you forget, a captain who looked at me like a colleague when he needed one. I am not a hero. I know what heroes cost, and I have seen that bill paid by people I respected. I am someone who showed up with the right training at the right moment and did not let fear make the decision for me. That distinction matters to me, maybe more than it needs to. My mother is doing well. The Parkinson's progression has been slow, and the medication is managing the tremors better than expected. She has opinions about my hair and my eating schedule and the fact that I don't attend church with her on the Sundays I'm in town, and she expresses all of them freely, and I would not trade any of it. Audrey and I are not the same as we were before. I'm not sure we will be. But we have dinner together twice a month at the house. And she brings wine, and I cook. And our mother sits between us at the table and talks about her exercise class and her garden and the neighbors and whatever she saw on the news. It is quiet and ordinary, and sometimes I look at the two of them across the table and I feel the particular weight of something preserved, not fixed, not perfect, but intact. I keep the notebook, not because I'm still waiting for something to document. Because the habit of precision is the thing that got me through, and I don't know who I would be without it. Every significant conversation, every decision point, every moment that needed to exist in the record, it's there. Not for a courtroom, not for a headline, just for me. A private flight log for a life I am still carefully flying. Some people ask me what it felt like to walk into that cockpit, what I was thinking, whether I was afraid. I tell them the truth. I was thinking about the frequency, about the authentication string, about the altitude discrepancy and which transponder reference would resolve it cleanest. I was not thinking about Audrey. I was not thinking about the estate or the injunction or the voicemail I had saved or the 4 months of careful documentation sitting in my notebook. I was thinking about the 200 people behind that door, and the fact that I had exactly the skill they needed and absolutely no good reason to pretend otherwise. That's all it was. That's the whole thing. The rest of it, the dinner table, the notebook, the Sunday afternoons, the letter from the captain, Barbara and her proposal, my mother's voice in Charlotte's office saying what she wanted with her hands folded in her lap. That's what happened after. And that part, I think, is the part that matters more. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since that November flight. Not in any grand philosophical way, just the plain practical kind. The kind where you trace a line backward from where you ended up and you can see clearly every decision that put you there. Audrey spent 2 years building a wall around her mother's life. She did it out of fear, she told me, and I believe her. But the method she chose, accessing records she had no right to, using my private history as a legal instrument, deciding unilaterally what I was capable of, that method had a cost, not a punishment handed down by anyone. Just the natural consequence of choosing control over honesty. When the truth came out, as it always does when someone has kept careful records, the thing she built couldn't hold. The estate. The power of attorney. The version of me she had constructed to justify her decisions. All of it had to be rebuilt from scratch, this time with both of us at the table. That's what I mean by cause and effect. It isn't poetic, it's just how things work when you pay attention long enough to see the full arc. What I keep coming back to is the notebook. My CEO told me to write things down before memory reads them. And that habit, that small, unglamorous discipline, ended up being the most important tool I had. Not the quick certification, not the clearance, the notebook. Because integrity doesn't mean much if you can't prove the shape of it. And you can't prove the shape of it if you haven't been paying attention. I think about that when I work with Barbara on her proposal, or when I think back on the trainees I briefed about communications protocol. The technical skill gets the job done in the moment. But the habit of precision, of documenting what happened, of saying what you mean and meaning what you say, that's what earns you the seat at the table before the crisis starts. And after it ends, Audrey taught me something too, even if she didn't intend to. She taught me that fear is not an explanation. It can be a reason, something you understand, something you extend compassion toward. But it cannot be a justification for the harm it causes. You don't get to dismantle someone's credibility because you're afraid of being replaced. You don't get to weaponize someone's private struggles because they inconvenience your plans. Understanding why someone did something and deciding it was acceptable are two completely different things. Audrey and I are working on that distinction together slowly, over dinner twice a month. The thing about resilience, real resilience, not the motivational poster kind, is that it is mostly invisible. It doesn't look like the cockpit moment. It looks like the parking lot at 11 at night, writing down exactly what was said before you're too tired to remember it accurately. It looks like calling all 3 attorneys the next morning even when you're not sure it will matter. It looks like keeping your voice level in Charlotte's office when what you actually feel is a specific kind of grief that doesn't have a clean name. I am not who I am because of one flight. I am who I am because of 8 years of showing up to hard things with the right preparation and the decision not to let fear make the call for me. That applies in a cockpit. It applies in a cockpit. It applies at a kitchen table in Akron when the person across from you is your sister and the thing between you is complicated and real and worth preserving. Write it down. Do the work. Trust what you've built. The rest tends to follow.